open the meeting and
work out what's the viable.
I'll take apologies first. Have apologies from the Deputy Mayor on council business. And
okay, mate. Thanks very much.
Also, Councillor Ranai and Councillor Webster-Tarbell, as you can see it there on the board.
Oh, and Councillor Quirks for lateness.
Any other apologies?
Councillor Quirks for lateness. He's on his
Councillor
way.
Quirks for lateness. And I'll move those. Second, please. Thank you, Councillor Brewer. And all those in favour say aye. Contrary, carried. And any declarations of interest for this meeting, members? None. We'll move on. Petitions, none. Public input. Is there any public input notified? None. Thank you. Local board input. Any local board input at this stage? We've got to do the minutes as well. Did I skip something? Number 3. I'll move confirmation of the minutes from 8 June. Can I have a second, please? Councillor Cooper, thank you. Favour, say aye. Contrary, no. Carried, thank you. And that takes us to our, takes us to our business of the day. And as outlined, and I will hand straight to John Dubert.
Great.
John.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we have 5 topics today. 2 were topics that were deferred from the last ADC meeting on the Unitary Plan a couple of weeks ago, and those were the topics of historic or special character and the pre-1944 overlay. So we'll kick off with those 2, and then we'll move into business, then rural, and then we'll close with a discussion on the rezoning principles. So I'll just invite, so for each of these topics, I'll invite I guess our key lead planner, as we call it, or call them, to just join us at the table. So for this one, we've got 2. We've got one of our heritage team leaders, Rebecca Fogel, and also Lisa Mean, who's our lead planner on special or historic characters. So we've been through this topic a number of times with you, both in the drafting of the plan for those who were here at that time, and also in response to the panel's interim guidance and to confirm the council's position at the RPS, Regional Policy Statement, and in the rules. So you'll be, I suspect, pretty familiar with this one, which is great. So really just to recap, in the notified plan that went out for submissions, we had an overlay. It was referred to as the special character overlay, and it managed the identified values of many of Auckland's older residential and business areas. The mapped areas in the overlay were largely rolled over from the operative district plans. For example, large parts of Devonport, Herne Bay, Mount Eden and Ponsonby were just some examples of areas that were rolled over. But we did have an opportunity in drafting the plan to introduce some new special character areas. For example, the Balmoral tram suburb, Kings Road, Princess Avenue, Mount Roskill, and an area in Papatoe as well. So that was a real positive move to actually get those into the plan and out for submissions. The overlay basically controls anyone wanting to do alterations or additions to houses or business premises within the overlay. It controls the demolition of buildings and the removal of buildings, and there are also some controls on the design of new buildings to recognise the character of these areas. The various rolled over areas had different controls in the operative district plans, even within, for example, the Auckland City or the North Shore plan. Each of the suburbs had slightly different controls, so we rolled that over into the plan so to recognise those differences. That was the agreement of the committee at the time. And in terms of public notification, demolition, total or substantial demolition, and in some cases removal of buildings within the overlay, the committee agreed prior to notification that that should be subject to the normal tests under the RMA. So just to recap on that, for notification in the unitary plan, we can either say always notified, never notified, or leave it to an assessment on a case-by-case basis under the RMA, and that was the approach that was in the notified plan. And we also had character descriptions of each of the areas, giving a brief summary of why they're considered to have a special character. So that was the approach in the notified plan. Where did the submitters come from? Well, as with all topics, a range of submissions, some in support, some in opposition. but just to unpack that a little bit more, there are a range of site-specific submissions asking for places to be added to or removed from the special character overlay, and in particular that areas built after 1944, because the vast majority of these areas that were developed before 1944, we did have submissions asking for more recent suburbs to be given character protection through the unitary plan by adding them to this overlay. For example, a submission that related to that was submission from the Ōrākei Local Board that the Tamaki Drive master plan should be reflected in the overlay or somehow included in the overlay, and there were other areas identified too. And we did have some submissions asking for some of the operative district plan rules to be more accurately reflected or included in the unitary plan, and including some recent plan changes in the Isthmus and the North Shore. So that's where the submitters were coming from. Some also sought changes to the activity status for additions, alterations and demolitions. Some wanted things to be more permissive, more permitted activities. Some wanted things to be more restrictive, moving towards non-complying or prohibited for things like demolition. Some want to change to the notification provisions, either to have more resource consent process non-notified, and others seeking that anything happening in these overlay areas should be publicly notified, including potentially alterations, additions and certainly demolition. Some wanted provisions to better reflect or recognise that infrastructure within these areas is just part of supporting housing and development and so on, and therefore should be better reflected and more enabled in the provisions. There were some restrictive controls there that were perhaps unintended. And some submitters sought amendments to add more information to these character statements. So these aren't rules, it's just background context. So we had submissions asking to beef up the character statements. So after reviewing the submissions, we had a position from the council to take into the hearings, and I'll split this into two parts. First of all, the policies and the rules, and then the maps. So in terms of the provisions or the policies and rules, picking up on the council's approach at the regional policy statement hearing, a change in terminology from special character to something a little bit more precise, where we're talking about historic character. These are predominantly historic areas, and that links them back to Section 6 in the RMA, which is issues of national importance, whereas special character sits further down in the RMA. So that signals an elevation in terms of the status and potentially a review of the mapping of these areas, which did occur. We also proposed amendments to strengthen the words of objectives and policies, get more standardisation across some of the different areas, and we did propose amendments to incorporate the plan changes for the Isthmus 163, or parts of those, and 33 in the North Shore, and that included more business character areas for the North Shore. I think at the time the unitary plan was notified that North Shore plan change hadn't reached the point where it could be included. The demolition threshold was changed from a volume-based threshold, I think, of 30%, anything more than 30%, to measuring the amount of the facades that's, or the surface area of the facades, and in particular the front facade that's being altered. And that was all worked through in mediation. Howick, we've had a few discussions at committee on this, and the provisions for Howick were essentially converted into a precinct rather than a historic character overlay. So that changed from special to historic when the heritage team looked at what was present in the Howick Town Centre. Their conclusion was, and also looking at the operative Manukau district plan, that a precinct in the unitary plan was a better tool to recognise Howick. And so the rules are essentially the same as in the operative Manukau plan. It's just a change in terminology from being a historic character area to a precinct for the Howick Town Centre. There were those minor amendments in the second bullet point there, just some clarity around the rules, further minor amendments in terms of the assessment criteria for the general historic character areas and the North Shore area, and more detailed character statements were put forward by council in the hearings. We then received interim guidance in July last year. This was reported through to the committee. As you may recall, the committee wanted to give this guidance before moving into the mapping. And so they were not convinced about the shift from special to historic character. At that point in time, they hadn't heard in detail from our heritage team, they hadn't seen in detail the results of the survey work that was carried out, but at that point in time they were not convinced in changing from special to historic character. They felt that that was a change that should go through a plan change after the entry plan becomes operative and open it up for submissions and a future hearing. They were supportive generally of the provisions that Council and Housing New Zealand had developed with others in mediation. They thought they were by and large okay, looking pretty good in terms of notification, demolition and things like that. They felt that that was looking in pretty good shape. They wanted more character statements and supported those. They felt that Howick should remain in the special character overlay, and that really relates back to the second bullet point. They just weren't convinced at that point in time that the shift to Section 6 national importance was the right way to go. They didn't support the inclusion of additional character areas in the PORP at this stage at all. So we did have those submitters that wanted new areas, those areas built after 1944, for example. The panel was saying, no, as part of this process, there's just not enough work, there hasn't been enough work done by the submitters, the council or anyone else to really get to the point of introducing new areas. And they felt that the normal test for notification under the Resource Management Act should generally apply. So Council's position in relation to the maps, so we had the hearing on the rules, we had the interim guidance from the panel. Now we look at the maps. The heritage team had done extensive survey work looking at individual properties and streets and other historical research. And of the 1,700 hectares originally in the overlay, the council's proposal at the hearings on the maps was to reduce that down to 1,400 hectares and change the name to historic character. That's a net reduction of just over 17% of the overlay. And the greatest areas affected by that reduced overlay were the Newmarket business area, so pretty much all of commercial Newmarket, or a large part of it, used to sit in the overlay. And of course there are many parts of Newmarket that certainly aren't historic anymore, so those areas were removed, but the older parts of Newmarket remained in the overlay. And then we had what was called Isthmus B in the Auckland, former Auckland City area, the suburbs of Remuera to St Heliers. There was a proposed reduction in the extent of the revised overlay there. Isthmus C in Glendowie was also proposed to be removed, and the heritage team had looked quite carefully at the western end of Stanley Point in Devonport and felt that that didn't meet the council's criteria for historic character. Many of the properties proposed to be excluded, and this I think is a key point, that while the overlay was reducing by 17%, and that's what the council took into the hearings, many of the properties within that 17% had no controls on demolition in the operative plans or in the notified plan. They were within a character overlay, but you could demolish as of right within that overlay. I think that's a key point to make. Not every property, but a large proportion of them had no demolition control on them. They just sat in an overlay. The change to the maps were considered by the council to be a more accurate reflection of the historic character neighbourhoods, suburbs of Auckland. And with the exception of incorporating those business sites in the North Shore from that plan change, no additional sites, streets or areas were proposed to be included in the overlay. The time frame and the analysis required to get something into the unitary plan simply didn't allow for that work. The submitters themselves hadn't done sufficient work to really justify recommending to the panel to include additional areas. Obviously there's a big opportunity for the heritage team and the council to incorporate new historic character areas in the future through plan changes to the unitary plan once it becomes operative. And as always, we have a slide here on the end, just if you want to look into the evidence from council and the submitters in more detail. There are the topic references and the link again to the panel hearings website, and your support staff can hopefully find that information or come to the planning staff for additional support to delve into this topic or any others in more detail.
Thank you, John. You can breathe now. So that's topic 29 and 79, special and historic character. Are there questions on that section, members? Councillor Quacks?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. John, in terms of
So, when the hearings panel considered that Howick should remain a special character area, that was based on a submission that they received?
I'll probably just ask Rebecca or Lisa to confirm that, please.
Yeah, that was based on submissions from the Howick Residents Association.
Okay. And there was no submissions asking for it to be removed, were there? No. Okay. I want to ask you a question because it talks all the way through here, and I just want to clarify this in my own mind. It talks all the way through here about special character. The hearings talks about special historic, in brackets, historic. So is there a distinction between being a special character area and being a historic area? Is there any...
Well, essentially, the council's position was to no longer refer to special character at all in the unitary plan. We moved away from that. So we have areas that are addressed through precincts that have specific controls that are more urban design-based controls. They do deal with the notion of urban design and form and appearance, but quite deliberately, there was a move to have historic character overlay in areas and precincts to control, to introduce special urban design or design and appearance provisions and no longer use the terminology special character at all. But the panel, certainly as of 15 July, was very keen to retain the word special character and not to have historic character in the unitary plan.
I see.
So we're just fundamentally philosophically at odds with the panel as of last July.
Yeah, okay. And I suppose and again, I suppose referring specifically to Howick, if it's changed to a precinct rather than a special character area, in order to change anything in that special character area, that would require a plan change, would it? Would require a plan change?
Just to clarify, is that to change the provisions in the unitary plan?
Yes.
Would require a plan change in the future, yep.
Yeah, okay, but not if it's a precinct, is that right?
Well, if the panel accepted that it's a precinct, not part of a historic or special character overlay, then if the council then accepted that recommendation in August, then if the council wanted to change that in the future, it would have to change that by a plan change, if that's your...
And that would require, so even under a precinct, it would still require a plan change and which would be supported by submissions.
If the council wanted to change it back to a special character overlay after the plan becomes operative, that would need a plan change. If the panel recommended a precinct in July,
yes,
and the council considered that that wasn't appropriate, then it would have to reject that recommendation from the panel and put forward an alternative approach.
Yeah, okay.
By 19 August. Yep.
Thank you, Councillor Quacks. Any other questions on this section? Councillor Brewer?
Just on the areas of refinement for the council, particularly pertaining to the eastern suburbs, Remuera through to St Heliers, which geographically is a big area, and then Glendowie proposed to be deleted. I'm just trying to get a sense, John, as much as you can, as to as to the quantum and nature of other submitters that might have submitted on our refinement in that regard, and I suppose the attitude or the response or the questioning of the IHP towards those submitters. So I just want to say, was this an area that was pushed back by other submitters when we refined that overlay in the eastern suburbs? And are you able to give any indication as to the IHP's indicative or view at all?
Mr Chairman, I'd hand over to Lisa, who sat through all of the mediation and the hearings. I guess the only thing is we just have to be a little bit cautious about speculating as to what the panel was thinking when one or two panel members might have asked questions. But certainly in terms of the thrust of the submissions and what submitters were asking for on either side, how did that play out at the hearing?
In terms of submissions, it was very balanced in those suburbs. People who wanted to be removed from the overlay and people who wanted it retained. And similarly at the hearings, it was quite balanced. Although people who had the relief that they were seeking didn't appear, by and large. In terms of the panel's view, they didn't express a view, so I couldn't possibly answer that.
And those that wanted to be retained, and what was the basis of their argument? And did they have, given that we'd gone through that comprehensive refinement, were they on thick ice as to their argument from your perspective?
Those that appeared at the hearings who wanted to be retained in the overlay, who possibly had, it tended to be umbrella groups that were appearing in that sense. So they would have been representing a number of views and not necessarily every landowner.
Okay, so you're saying like residents' associations and the likes?
Predominantly heritage groups.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Casey?
It's a process question. Just in terms of the interim guidance, what's the legal position of that if the full-time guidance is radically different from the interim guidance? And an associated question is, how much of the plan did we receive interim guidance on in terms of percentage-wise?
So I think we only received about a dozen pieces of interim guidance, and there are roughly 65 topics in the unitary plan, broad topics. So interim guidance on about a dozen of those. Catherine Anderson is here, but my initial response would be the interim guidance was very much pitched by the panel as our thinking at this point in time, and has a very clear message in the interim guidance that they have the ability to change their mind completely, and that is quite possible once they've heard more evidence, more arguments. So they did it where they reached a sort of interim landing point, but they were still open to hearing other arguments. And so I don't believe it's legally binding in any way, but Catherine, yeah, it's not legally binding in any way, shape or form on the panel or the council.
But you would expect it to be somewhat in line with their interim thoughts. You wouldn't expect for too radical a departure in terms of this section we're discussing today.
Well, in terms of this particular topic, we put, and others where we received interim guidance, for example, on the, what's another core topic?
Height-sensitive areas, volcanic view shafts.
Yeah, view shafts, for example, we had interim guidance that the panel felt there were too many restrictions. The view shafts were potentially causing a problem. We basically stepped up our arguments and just ran as strong a case as possible. So in doing that, you'd be hopeful that perhaps the panel may change its view, but we just don't know. So.
Thanks, Councillor. And I forgot to welcome the Mayor. Welcome, Mr. Mayor. And local board chairs here, that are here today, thank you for being here. Andy and Peter, and I saw Simon here as well. And Mark, thank you, and it's your question, Mark.
John, I'm right, this is at a high level, essentially an RMA Section 6 versus Section 7 argument about how we define character.
That's correct.
And so the failure is probably a pejorative word. The change from the notified status to the revised council position, how much of that do you think was driven by the lack of perhaps work we were able to do substantiating what character might be, what special character might be?
We took a rollover approach, and in doing that, particularly for the Isthmus 2 and 3 areas, we didn't do any further analysis before notifying the plan as to whether those areas really were special, and certainly did no analysis in terms of whether they met Section 6. So then we did the analysis in response to submissions asking for more clarity around what special character meant, for the overlay to be reduced. So we looked at those submissions, did the heritage survey work, and had a more robust case for retaining some areas, but the 17%, we had the evidence to say that actually it's certainly not historic character. It has a character, but then all of Auckland has a character of some sort.
But the issue really is this the vexed problem of defining the Section 7 sort of character, isn't it? That's the issue. We're still not much further along from where we've been in terms of
defining what special is. And so council's preferred approach going to the hearings was, well, we can pretty clearly define what historic character is and looks like. Special character, you could potentially apply to many, many parts of Auckland, perhaps all of Auckland.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you. I think we'll move to the pre-1944 overlay, which is slides 12 to 20. And John, I think, are you going to take us through, lead those again, John? We'll take questions when we get to 20.
So there's clearly a relationship between the previous topic and this topic here. And we've always sort of presented to the committee the two topics together. So at the regional policy statement level, the council had signalled in the proposed unitary plan that a precautionary approach was a good approach, because there are parts of Auckland that are potentially of historic heritage significance or value, and we just haven't discovered them yet or done the analysis yet. That approach involved managing areas where there's a concentration of buildings built prior to 1944 through an overlay that controls demolition of buildings that were built prior to 1944. So if you're in the overlay and you built after 1944, there was no demolition control, but certainly if you're older than 44 in the overlay, there was a demolition control, and that was all signalled right up at the regional policy statement as a precautionary approach. The area may have historic heritage or historic character values, and demolition may result in a reduction of architectural character or streetscape values, but we're just not sure, so we acknowledge that it was precautionary. In the notified plan, in terms of the rules within the overlay, as I mentioned, it controls the demolition of buildings that might fall into the categories of being individual heritage buildings that could go on our heritage schedule, or they might be part of a broader streetscape of historic character. It was based on a similar approach in the Brisbane, for Brisbane. The mapping or the spatial extent of the overlay was based on a rating database, which indicated where there were buildings prior to 1944. And the rules controlled the demolition of buildings as a restricted discretionary activity where more than 30% of the building was being demolished. And there was also control on the construction of new buildings at the rear of these buildings, but less controls than in the special or historic character overlay. Subject to the normal RMA tests, so that was the same as the other overlay. And basically the process involves, if you want to demolish a building built prior to 1944 within the overlay, there's an assessment of whether the building is a standalone heritage building or place, or whether the building contributes to that wider streetscape character. And I'm using the term special character here because we're talking about the plan that went out for submissions, not the council's position once we got into the hearings. That's coming up shortly. The submitters, wide range of submissions, probably more submissions on this overlay than the special or historic character overlay, I suspect, because this one has certainly generated quite a bit of public interest because it was a new control and it was affecting many thousands of properties that had never had this sort of demolition control in the past. Many refinements sought to the overlay, including reducing its spatial extent or potentially expanding it, including submissions that wanted this overlay to apply to all of Auckland, i.e. any building built prior to 1944 in Auckland should have some form of heritage control, regardless of where it is or what condition it's in or whether it's standalone or part of a street. Reducing the overlay, removing the overlay in its entirety, there were all the sorts of submissions that we had. Some site-specific submissions asking for individual properties or groups of properties to be added or removed. Some submitters asked for the overlay to have an expiry date or a sunset clause, so they recognised council was taking a precautionary approach to allow for extensive heritage work, survey work to be undertaken to then put out an expanded historic character overlay. So some submitters said that's fine, but there needs to be a sunset clause 2-3 years down the line. And there were a range of submissions challenging the principles to the approach and the use of 1944 as a date. Why 44? Why not 50? Why not 1940? The submissions from Mana Whenua to allow development of treaty settlement land within the overlay in a more permissive way. Submitters seeking amendments to the activity status for demolition, some wanting it more permissive and some more restrictive, and also that control around new buildings at the rear. Again, some people wanting that to be permitted, some wanting it to be more restrictive. We had submitters asking that the overlay manage other activities, like the alterations and additions that you might find in the character overlay. And amendments to the notification provisions, again, from asking that the unitary plan specifies that any demolition is non-notified, and others asking that any demolition is always notified. And of course, the plan that went out for submissions was, let's have a case-by-case assessment under the section 94 of the RMA, 95. Some submitters sought that the council bear the costs for the resource consent process, and council does bear some of the costs within this overlay in terms of reimbursing applicants if it's concluded that the building is not a heritage building or within a historic character streetscape. Then there is a refund to the applicant of at least a proportion, if not all, of the costs. So that was endorsed by council at the same time the unitary plan was notified, and has obviously assisted a number of applicants over the last 2 or 3 years. Council's position at the hearings, we did propose the insertion of a sunset clause. I think that's 3 year from operative, from when the plan becomes operative, at which point the overlay would no longer apply, and that gives the 3 year time frame to do more heritage survey work and introduce, by way of plan changes, new historic character areas. That demolition threshold changed from that volume of the building that's being demolished to the surface area facades, which gives greater protection. Amendments to remove the rule that manages new buildings at the rear. It was felt that that rule didn't really, wasn't really justified. Amendments to clarify the assessment process, and that's that 2-step assessment. Is it a heritage place or is it part of a historic character area? And amendments to enable consideration of the social, cultural and economic benefits when assessing resource consents. Now that's something that was really pushed for by parties like Housing New Zealand and a collective of property developers who were saying, surely given this precautionary approach and that there are many, many streets within the overlay that aren't of historic character, surely there should be some assessment of the benefits of developing land within the overlay. Interim guidance also received on this overlay. Again, it was after the hearing on the rules that we've just talked about, but before the hearing on the maps. And I won't read this out, but I think, as you've heard before, the panel was not convinced in any way, shape or form that there should be a pre-1944 overlay. So in terms of the mapping, we carried on, arguing that there should be a pre-1944 overlay. But a significantly reduced overlay on the basis of over a year's worth of work led by Rebecca and Tony Barnes in the heritage team. The overlay was proposed to be reduced by 86%. 83% of that, the vast majority, was from the heritage survey work. There was an additional 3% proposed to be reduced because of the location of some of these areas in close proximity to major public transport hubs. The heritage survey, very extensive piece of work, proposed to uplift or remove the overlay for heritage reasons, generally because the area had a high concentration of buildings built after 1944. So using that rating database, it really shows you that that wasn't a robust way to go. When you actually visit many of these streets, large concentration of buildings built after 1944. Many reasons why that might have occurred, but that's just the reality on the ground. And the planning analysis sought to balance those outcomes in the regional policy statement around protecting historic character, but also enabling growth in close proximity to major transport hubs where major investment is going into improving that transport. And again, further information, this one's topic 30 and topic 79. 79 for the mapping, 30 for the policies and the rules.
Thank you, John. So, on the pre-1944, queries from members, local board members, Councillor Cashmore?
Mr. Cook, was there any
contention about the survey work and the quality of that? Was there any contestability around that?
Rebecca?
There were some people, like particularly the Character Coalition, who thought that perhaps it wasn't robust enough, and then some other groups who sort of questioned that, but nobody put up an alternative method for carrying out that work at the hearing.
Thank you. Councillor Casey?
The panel considered no evidence was available to suggest that the pre-1994 buildings are at any significant risk of demolition or relocation, and also the panel considered there was no evidence available that the areas where the pre-1944 buildings are at risk of losing their character. Did we present any evidence? Did they just discount the evidence that was presented?
So we did present some evidence about the risk of loss,
Yes.
and part of it is that it's actually very difficult to sort of count the risk. They were asking for information on, well, how many consents have been declined, and we sort of explained that some of that, actually we had applications that were withdrawn, or we had conversations in the pre-application phase that resulted in them not submitting an application at all, and actually, it has been working in that regard, and we are seeing stuff come through, but it might not be easily measurable. And the other issue is that until this overlay came in, we had no method of counting how many demolitions occurred prior to this. And that was explained to the panel. And again, that was after they issued that interim guidance.
So now they've got evidence.
So hopefully we convinced them that there is a risk to loss of these buildings.
Thank you. Councillor Walker?
Sure. Just looking at the related rules and construction of new buildings, and then there's the issue around demolition. What's the story as it applies if somebody wants to shift one of these pre-1944 buildings forward so that they can fit the building on the back? Is that covered under the restricted discretionary? So they're not demolishing it?
Yep. So the rule covers demolition or removal from the site, so that includes tearing it down or trucking it away. It doesn't actually cover relocating the building within the site, so that would be allowed. And the reason why that rule for construction at the back, in discussions about this overlay and in response to the submissions, basically, the council position was to clarify the rule that really it's about the loss of these buildings and controlling that worst case scenario.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Councillor. Further queries on the pre-1944? Councillor Lee?
Yes, I just want to make the point that while this overlay, demolition control overlay, was certainly based on something similar in Brisbane, I think that was 1940 in Brisbane. The Brisbane overlay is a real, genuine moratorium. You don't touch, you don't mess with buildings that are pre-1940 unless there is a serious health and safety problem or something of that nature. This overlay is that you have to go and get a resource consent before you blow it away. And that essentially is all that it's about. Now, it's better than nothing, I guess, but this council has to take it to the next level in terms of the Resource Management Act and make these demolitions non-complying or prohibited if need be, and then we would be really like Brisbane, which really values its historic townscapes.
Thank you. Okay, I think we'll move to the business section. Next topics. John, with you again. Jeremy Wyatt. Welcome, Jeremy.
So Jeremy is the business.
Thank you, Lisa and Rebecca. Hi, Jeremy. You going to lead it?
Yeah.
Jeremy?
Okay, thank you. So, starting off at the RPS again, Regional Policy Statement. key approaches there, providing for a network of centres in Auckland that support the quality compact urban form, encouraging commercial activities. And so when we talk about commercial activities in this presentation, we're really talking mainly about office and retail as opposed to industrial activities, or residential. So office and retail, mainly within centres, enable them along specifically identified what we call growth corridors, and then in some other areas where appropriate. But there's a sort of three-tier approach, and that goes right back to some pre-amalgamation discussions on, Jeremy, can you just remind me? Plan Change 6 to the regional policy statement of the former regional council. So enabling sufficient supply of land for industrial activities was as another key plank in the policy plank in the regional policy statement, in the right locations, and avoiding incompatible activities, for example, residential, locating close to one another, so industrial and residential, trying to avoid that situation. Ensure development within centres and other commercial zones positively contributes to an attractive and efficient urban environment. So that's at the regional policy statement level. Moving down into the provisions, the rules themselves, there were 5 centre zones in sort of decreasing scale from the city centre, metropolitan centres, town centres, local centres and small neighbourhood centres. Those are the 5 commercial zones, the 5 centre zones. They generally, they provide for commercial, so retail and office, civic activities and residential above street level. And larger centres are often our major transport hubs. The other commercial zones are the mixed-use general business and business park zones. We call them commercial zones because they also allow for some office or retail. The mixed-use zone provides for residential and supporting office and retail. The general business zone is mainly the sort of large format retail zone for the big box retail in Auckland that's not in a centre. And the business park zone applies to a small number of standalone office parks out of centres. We then have the industrial zones, 2 industrial zones, light industry and heavy industry. They both allow for industrial uses. The light industry allows for greater range of non-industrial uses, but is pretty restrictive on, certainly restrictive on residential and larger format retail. The location of commercial activity, in terms of the rules, seeking to implement that regional policy statement direction about primarily locating office and retail in centres, then along identified mapped growth corridors, and then other areas as a sort of third lower tier. Office and retail permitted in centres, more restrictive activity status in other areas with assessment criteria to look at whether or not there should be retail happening outside of centres. And there was only one specifically identified growth corridor, and that was Lincoln Road. In terms of the supply, protection of industrial land, key controls to avoid reverse sensitivity, i.e. things like residential moving into industrial areas, some strict controls on that. Restriction on commercial activities going into industrial areas as well, because if that's the sort of highest, best use for the land, then potentially we're displacing industrial land and we'll lose our supply of industrial land. So that's another key approach there. But in terms of design issues, the industrial zones did not have design controls. It was felt that it was appropriate to specify things like height limits and so on, but not to actually call in every industrial building for an urban design assessment in an industrial area. And that's by and large what the operative district plans, it's the approach that they have taken for many years without too many problems. But in terms of urban design in centres and in terms of heights and also in the mixed use and the general business zones, key policies and rules around creating a quality built environment with combination of rules and assessment criteria. So most significant alterations to buildings in centres and the mixed use zone and the general business zone would require resource consent, and any new building would require resource consent. Height limits, they range, but in the smaller local centres, of which there are about 40 in the entry plan and in the Auckland plan, The heights range from 12.5 to 16.5 metres, which is basically 3 to 4 levels. The 3-level local centres were typically within the historic character overlay. Town centres range from 12.5 metres right up to 48.5 metres in a small number of cases. Again, the 12.5 tended to be the historic character town centres, and up at the 48.5 end, I think that's Avondale was in that category. Pakuranga. Yep. So this is the notified plan, and the metropolitan centres were generally 72.5 metres, and I think that equates to about 18 levels or so. So that was the approach in the notified plan. The submitters, in terms of the location of office and retail, they considered that more of these growth corridors needed to be identified, not just Lincoln Road, to accommodate expansion of commercial activity in the future. Others felt that that wasn't required, that we should have a strong centres approach, centres only. Some wanted more flexibility for supermarkets, department stores, bulk retail, and office right throughout the business zones. In terms of the supply and protection of industrial land, some submitters were asking for more flexibility to get retail and office into industrial areas. Some wanted to enable existing heavy industry that's sitting in the light industrial zone to continue to operate. So we do have some areas within the light industrial zone where there is a more noxious, more heavy industry site. We didn't spot zone those sites heavy industry, but that did generate quite a lot of submissions saying, well, I'm clearly heavy industry. I'm discharging to the air emissions and so on, but I'm sitting in a light industrial zone. So we heard submitters asking for some changes there. And some wanted to delete the requirement to publicly notify resource consents for retail and office in the light industrial zone. In terms of design issues and heights, most submitters were concerned that the provisions were too restrictive and will create unnecessary resource consents with no real benefit, leading to inefficiencies and delays. Some wanted to increase the height limits, some wanted to decrease them across the board or in specific town centres, and some wanted to remove the control. We had a control that had a minimum storey height of possibly 4 metres, and some wanted that control deleted. We then received the interim guidance from the panel on the regional policy statement business provisions, and they indicated that they supported commercial growth on transport corridors and centres. They thought that was a good approach. They had a concern that some of the policies were trying to manage trade competition between retailers, and they felt we were stepping beyond what you can do in the Resource Management Act. And they considered that the urban design controls, which they hadn't heard in detail at that point at all, but they felt from what they read in submissions or looked at in terms of the plan, they were too detailed and too restrictive. Our position at the hearing on the commercial issue, 5 new growth corridors were identified. They were worked through with local boards, identifying these corridors: Lincoln Road, Stoddart Road, Waira Road to Irarangi Drive and New North Road. So more flexibility for commercial activity would be allowed on those if the panel accepted or recommended that back to the council. Changes to activity status for supermarkets in some locations, and a new rule to require resource consent for small-scale retail in the mixed-use zone that's not anywhere near a centre. And that was a concern, that the mixed-use zone could actually turn into a new de facto centre and actually kill off the retail in an existing centre, and all of the benefits in terms of investing in transport and civic amenities in that centre could be lost as a result of that dispersal out into the mixed-use zone. In terms of protecting industrial land, a bit of recognition of existing commercial activities, office and retail, in an existing heavy industry in the light industrial zone. So it's not a pure zone that has no office or retail or heavy industry at all. So there was some recognition in policies that there are some individual sites that don't entirely fit 100%, but it didn't make sense to spot zone those sites. Amendments proposed to the air quality overlay or air quality amenity policies from high to moderate in the light industrial zone, and an amendment to delete the requirement to always notify retail and office in the light industrial zone, and it was replaced with that notification assessment under the RMA. In terms of urban design and heights, some of the urban design rules were proposed to be deleted, simplified to become more efficient and focused on the critical must-haves from a design point of view, but they were supplemented by assessment criteria, design criteria that would still achieve the same outcome. So many buildings, most buildings in centres will have to come in for resource consent rather than having 35 rules to comply with. There are a smaller number of rules, but there is a design assessment process to pick up on design issues. Amendments to clarify that growth and development in appropriate locations is a positive outcome, and amendments to delete that minimum storey height and increase the height standards slightly in some town centres and in local and neighbourhood centres and the mixed-use zone. Key examples, 12.5 to 13 metres for some of the town and local centres and all neighbourhood centres, 16.5 metres to 18 metres, and this was off the back of some detailed urban design analysis in the mixed-use zone and some of the centres, and 20.5 metres to 21 and 24.5 to 27 in some of the other town centres and mixed-use areas. And that's it for business from the regional policy statement down into the various business zones.
Questions on the business category, Councillor Clifford?
Thank you. Your comments about these corridors, if they're allowed to have retail displacing metro centres, I mean, you've seen that result there in Lincoln Road already, industrial being sort of unfettered retail. So I'm just kind of not, is that where it says the interim guidance, the second part of the interim guidance, is that what the panel are talking about, saying they think that's restrictive not to allow retail in those areas, or because it's not very well explained? Are they saying there that they think that retail should be allowed in those areas or not?
Just check, is this the correct slide up on the screen here?
Well, you've got interim guidance.
Yep.
I'm looking at topic 051, maybe it's not the RPS, sorry. No, business zone provisions I'm talking about. Or does someone want to do on the RPS first? I'm just talking about business zone provisions. It's on page 29.
You are talking about the interim guidance, is that
I'm talking about the interim guidance,
So if we can get that slide up.
The second point.
It was the one you were just on previously, I think. That's the one?
Yeah.
And you were talking about one of those bullet points?
Yeah, so you said, John was saying, you know, that we're concerned, our position is we're concerned if we've got metro centres and then we allow retail and office space into light industrial, we displace growth and development in the metro centres. And I mean, classic example is Lincoln Road. We've got two metro centres within 5, 6, 8k of each other, and that's slap bang in the middle. And we've seen the rampant kind of, I suppose, disregard over time of elected people making decisions around that. So is that what what you've talked about, having in the council's position at the hearing, to have a resource consent, to have that it can't be as of right. But when it says in the second bullet point, what does the IHP mean when they say that?
So the idea behind identifying growth corridors is that we would like to get all commercial activity into centres if we could, but there's just not enough space for all the retail activities that we expect to be needed in the future.
You mean in the metro centres, so
Exactly.
they're concerned that there won't be enough space, so it should go in the corridors, or it can go in the corridors?
Preferably go into corridors rather than dispersed around the area or around the region even more. So having a long one corridor is preferable from a transport perspective, rather than having all these different places set up with
If you had good
commercial
public
activities.
transport along the corridors, it would be, but anyway,
So
okay.
in Lincoln Road, it's not a great environment, we know
Disaster.
that. But to say that we wouldn't necessarily allow any more commercial activity, or that more commercial activity there shouldn't take place,
It's not the commercial, it's the retail, that's the problem.
Yeah, you're right, the retail activity.
So that's what it's saying.
We'd
here.
find it difficult to turn the clock back in terms of trying to get rid of that retail, so we've identified that as as a growth corridor in the sense that more activity there could take place subject to resource consent and taking into account particularly effect on those proximate metropolitan centres that you talked about.
So could I just ask, Mr Chair, but we've never seemed to ever take that into account before. Will this, if the unitary plan says that we should, that means in a resource consent that'll have to take that into account, because before, we've never taken that into account before. We've just said, even if a council's had a strategy that says we're going to have development here and here, it doesn't seem to be able to be taken into account when they're doing the resource consent. So will this mean that now that will have to be taken into account? Considering it.
I think previously councils have tried to take it into account, but I don't think the plans have always been very well expressed in terms of giving a cohesive strategy in terms of how to do that, and I think the unitary plan perhaps is a step
So you think
forward.
that'll give that guidance, better guidance?
I certainly think the guidance is better. I think it's a tough area because the law around commercial activities and the effects they have on centres is a little bit vague. It's a little bit hard to show that, say, a new commercial activity is having an effect on a centre, and that's through a series of environment court decisions that's happened, you know, over the life of the RMA. So it's always an ongoing battle, but the idea is that now we've got a better strategy. Perhaps we can actually slow that growth and get commercial activity into more appropriate locations.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr Chairman.
Mark Thomas.
Just a clarification question on the new height levels of town centres. So that's just an increase from 12.5 to 13 metres, John, for those, obviously, town centres for which that applied, right? Because there were a range of minimum heights, weren't there, across the different town centres?
That's probably best to
Yep, that's right. There is no standard height for town centres.
that's
So
right.
as you know, you look on the map and that'll tell you what the height is.
Yeah.
So depending on what height you're shown in the notified version is 12.5, that would increase to 13.
And, I mean, that's still 3 stories, though, isn't it?
The idea is that would still be 3 stories, yes.
It just gives what more, why the increase, I suppose, isn't it?
The increase is actually designed to try and make sure that there is only 3 stories in there. So with an increase to, say, 13 metres or from 16 to 16.5, because we deleted the minimum story height control, there may now be an avenue for developers to say, hey, I can fit an extra story in here. You know, that's going to increase my yield quite a lot. And so you might try and squeeze floor stories into where before you could only fit 3. It'd be quite a strong incentive to do that because your yield would increase. And so that's why we've got the slight increase, but also the 2 metres for roof form. So the effective height has actually decreased in terms of the stories you can fit in.
2 metres for roof form or 1.5 metres?
It varies on, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Walker?
Yeah, just looking at commercial growth, transport corridors, as well as in centres, how do you deal with a situation that may have been alluded to before, where we'll see all this peripheral development along corridors and we don't see the integrity of a centre, and the situation where it's not sustainable, you can't walk anywhere because everything's just all over the place. So we got a mechanism for dealing with that, and obviously there's the related.
Start again.
Well, we can't start again.
It's like Huapai Kumeu, isn't it, Wayne?
We can't start again, but at least we can try and get on top and don't have things worse than what we've got, because it's a bloody nightmare. Oh, excuse me, I didn't realise I was on camera.
Did you have a
Well, say it again,
response
Wayne.
to that?
Take two.
I guess the response is that, you know, ideally we'd like to see these activities in centres. As I said, we don't really have the space for them. You know, developers now like to have large format retail activities. Along those identified corridors, we provide for some of those large format retail activities to take place through a consent process. When appropriate, we don't allow for small activities. So we're not trying to create another centre, a long strip centre. We recognise that in a lot of those large format retail activities, people will be driving anyway. They're often not popping from one small activity to the next like they do in a centre, so we kind of think it's making the best of a bad situation.
Okay, and other issue just around the heights, I'm assuming we've still got flexibility in a customised approach to circumstances, and I can think of one centre where it's on a ridge, so those earlier customised heights are still in place?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. John, just a query, you said when we're on slide 29, and we're on the third bullet point at the bottom of that interim guidance on 29, around urban design controls, you said that was their response, but they hadn't actually read the detail at that time. Yet the comment here is that the urban design controls were overly detailed and restrictive. Can you just expand or explain the panel's interim guidance if they hadn't actually seen it?
Well, we can only assume that they had read the provisions and read some of the submissions, but they hadn't heard council's evidence or the evidence from submitters. But while they were going through the regional policy statement hearings, some or potentially all of the panel had read the business zone design controls and read some of the submissions. That's all we can assume.
But they
So
hadn't.
they're foreshadowing some concerns prior to the hearing commencing, on an interim basis with the caveats that they may well change their mind.
Which is not different to their interim guidance on height-sensitive areas and volcanic view shafts where they hadn't completed.
Slightly different because that hearing had actually commenced and then was adjourned and then the guidance came out. Yeah, slightly different. This was a bit earlier. Yeah, view shafts, they'd actually started the hearing on the view shafts.
That's true. Thank you.
The rules and adjourned the hearing. Yep.
Mr. Mayor?
Yeah, just so following on behind Wayne's sort of comment question. So just can you reflect back to me whether the submissions or the interim guidance reflected the fact that we have in effect a mesh block operating, which is basically the our urban regeneration or development plan through the unitary plan overlaid by the transport plan. So do you see a strong connectivity between those two, particularly as they go to rapid transit networks and all that sort of thing? You know, if we, you know, are looking at the possibility of greater compact growth around our suburban retail commercial sectors, ideally they should be linking up with our rapid transit networks, buses, ferries for coastal networks, walkways, cycleways, etc. So just give us some reflections on whether or not there was a lot of guidance or comment back about the connectivity or the intermeshing of those two key focuses.
There wasn't a lot in the interim guidance per se, but I think the panel accepted that obviously transport is a key part of the urban form, and where you're locating your commercial activities and centres, you want that to be strong transport hubs, so you can make use of the public transport that goes along with that. And the growth corridors are another step beyond that, in the sense that they're trying to get larger numbers of large format retail activities in one area, so you don't have multi-trips all around the region, and you're restricting it to a single corridor, preferably with public transport on it to enable access for people who wish to use public transport.
Just to follow that up, so one of the things that we've done at really the same time as we're going through this unitary plan process is that we've done a massive review of our bus network operation. So have we accounted for that in our final submissions?
Yes, all the evidence that council presented was on the basis of the future transport network coming operative, you know, in 2025. So we're looking at the planned frequent transport network, and so that was all taken into account as part of council's evidence.
We actually have made a lot of changes to the proposed bus schedules that went out. I mean, how they reschedule, I suspect, will have quite a significant impact on people's movement in and around our commercial and social centres. So just a note, John.
Yeah, well, Mr Mayor, if I could just make a comment that Yeah, there's always a little bit of an iterative approach to any sort of infrastructure planning and land use planning, and they're not always 100% perfectly in sync. And I think with the transport network, we've worked with Auckland Transport through these hearings on all the topics to try and make sure we're as aligned as possible, but sometimes, you know, there may be a need to review the unitary plan in the future if there are some situations where the transport, you know, because it won't necessarily be fixed forever. So you just have to be nimble enough to get as close as you possibly can to align transport and infrastructure to the best of your knowledge and ability at the point in time. But if there are reasons to change one, then the other just needs to catch up. So it's a bit like that. But I think they're very close in terms of where we got to at the hearings.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Jeremy. I think we're ready to go to... Oh, sorry, Councillor Wood.
Yeah, just in relation to those commercial activities and the panel's interim guidance on page 29, and I'm talking about transport corridors again.
Yes.
Is that, when you're saying transport corridors and you mention Wairau Road, is that just the transport? I mean, how do you define the transport corridor there?
Well, I must admit, when the panel gave their guidance, the submitters were a little bit, we didn't quite understand what they meant by supporting commercial growth on transport corridors, because that was their language and it wasn't clear to us what that actually meant. Did they mean one or two transport corridors? Did they mean every transport corridor? So it was kind of unclear. But at the district plan hearings, we discussed that with the panel, and they clarified that they were talking about specifically identified growth corridors. So the concept of identifying growth corridors for large format retail in a few locations around the area was something that they, at that time, supported.
Yeah, okay. They didn't give you, I mean, what's the width of a corridor, or is that just a subjective thing on each, and each one had to be looked at on its merits?
That's exactly right. You know, you're looking at transport, you're looking at the existing environment, you're looking at surrounding residential, you're looking at a range of things, whether there's access to good public transport. So you're looking at a range of criteria to assess whether a corridor in that area would be appropriate. And, you know, one of the things you're also looking at is whether there is plenty of land around there for retail activities already. Do we even need any more retail activities along that corridor, because we've got a metropolitan centre and town centre next door with space in them? And council did a lot of work through the Remu department, identifying areas of Auckland where there were surpluses or deficits in terms of the ability to provide for the projected retail growth. And in the end, they came out with a recommended 5 corridors. Submitters wanted a few more.
Okay, so obviously resource consent, you could go for a resource consent if you were in close proximity to these areas.
Yep, the corridors are all mapped on GIS, so if you're within that mapped area, then, for example, a large format retail activity would be a restricted discretionary activity. You'd be looking at transport amongst other things, but also the effect on centres and whether that would have an adverse effect on those centres.
So does the centre's policies of previous former councils still have bearing on these transport corridor situations?
Well, I guess they do at the moment, but when the unitary plan, fingers crossed, becomes operative, then the unitary plan will take precedence.
Thank you, Councillor. Jeremy, I think you've answered everybody's queries. Thank you for that. We'll move from business to rural, and I think we've got Bain Cross and Barry Mosley. Welcome, gentlemen.
All right.
John, you'll take us through.
So
there's quite a few slides here, I think.
Probably more slides on this than the previous 3, and to be honest, this is actually one of the most challenging topics in the unitary plan rule. Possibly not the most contentious in terms of the number of submitters, because obviously more people living in urban Auckland, but there's some pretty thorny issues out there in rural Auckland. That's certainly the legacy Franklin and Rodney councils, and Manukau as well, have been grappling with, and the former regional council for many years. So where do we get to with the regional policy statement? Well, there's a section on sustainably managing our rural environment. There are three key themes that run through this presentation. The first one is rural activities, and by that we mean things like ensuring that rural production continues to make a significant contribution to Auckland's economy, and that it's protected from inappropriate subdivision use and development. So that's the key regional policy statement thrust around what happens in rural areas from an activity point of view. In terms of land with high productive potential, the regional policy statement talked about retaining both elite soils, which are mapped, and also prime soils for primary production, as opposed to housing or other non-rural uses, and minimise its loss as a result of subdivision development. And lastly, the other big thorny topic is rural subdivision. And the approach in the regional policy statement is to manage that subdivision to ensure that the productive potential of rural Auckland is not compromised. So that's sitting up there at the regional policy statement. Getting down into the rules, there were 5 proposed rural zones. The main one, most extensive one, is the general rural production zone. As you'd imagine, it allows for a wide range of rural production activities and intensive farming. Then we have the mixed rural zone, which also enables a wide range of rural production, but you'll tend to see in these areas smaller sites. There's a bit more what we call fragmentation of the land, or smaller sites basically. In these areas, there's a bit more commercial activity. There's some existing rural lifestyle in the mixed rural areas of Auckland, and the provisions in the plan anticipate a greater variety of activities than you might see in the rural production zone. Then in coastal areas, we have mapped the rural coastal zone, properties in many cases that immediately abut the coastal marine area, and in some cases further inland. Again, enables general rural production, but resource consents are often required in the rural coastal zone, not because of the zone itself, but there are often landscape overlays, like the outstanding natural landscape, sitting over properties in the rural coastal zone, which tend to call in things like greenhouses for a resource consent because of their impact on landscapes. Then we have the countryside living areas, generally around or near more urban areas or rural and coastal settlements, providing for rural lifestyle development. And last but not least, least in terms of the extensive mapping of it, the rural conservation zone, predominantly in the Waitakere Ranges area, some I think in the Hanua Ranges as well. None at all, Bain says. So it's pretty much all in Waitakere Ranges. Enables rural activities and some residential activities, but a very conservative approach to activities in this area. We also have, Kaua Island and Waiti. So that was the zones. So just taking the theme of rural activities, they're generally enabled in the rural production, mixed rural and rural coastal zones, and by that we're talking about farmings permitted, forestry, greenhouses, intensive farming, poultry, piggeries, and equestrian. Pretty permissive approach to all of those in those 3 zones. Residential amenity is recognised as having some importance in the countryside living areas, but in other rural zones the emphasis is very much on productive rural use rather than protecting residents from noise and so on. Simple bulk and location controls for rural activities, very simple suite of controls, and related activities to rural activities generally have to go through a resource consent. Things like tourist and visitor accommodation, cafes and so on, garden centres have a resource consent path. They're not permitted as of right in rural areas. Moving on to land with high productive potential, the notified plan had quite strict controls in place to protect that land, elite and prime land, from subdivision and development. They favour rural production on that land and also provisions to minimise reverse sensitivity adjacent to land with high productive potential. and strict controls to minimise that fragmentation or splitting up prime productive land into smaller titles, and provisions to encourage the amalgamation of sites that have high productive potential. Related to that, rural subdivision, the overall approach in the notified plan was to reduce any further fragmenting of sites or creation of new sites in rural Auckland as a whole, and maintain the productive potential of the land for all good economic reasons. Overall strategy of no net increase in the number of sites in rural Auckland. And if you look at the maps of rural Auckland, there are many, many sites that were subdivided many, many years ago. So there's plenty of potential already for housing to establish on many of those sites that have been sitting there dormant for many years. So there's certainly not an undersupply of rural properties. But general subdivision was provided for in the countryside living zone. So just to sort of expand on that subdivision with a little bit more detail, it was a prohibited activity in the rural production or the mixed rural zone to subdivide land into anything less than 150 hectares, which is obviously huge, unless you were amalgamating two adjacent sites or two or more adjacent sites. You could transfer a title to another part of rural Auckland, or there was also a provision to protect Indigenous biodiversity and be able to subdivide as a result of doing that. And there were some technical provisions to allow for shifting of boundaries in rural Auckland to enable them to fit to the existing rural activity that was happening on the land. In terms of rural coast and rural conservation, much more restrictive. General subdivision was just simply prohibited, and there was no ability to amalgamate or transfer into these areas, or I think out of these areas, through amalgamation or protection of vegetation, but there was that boundary adjustment provision in those zones as well. Countryside living, as you'd expect, potential for subdivision, specific minimums for all the different countryside living parts of Auckland that were largely rolled over from the operative district plans. The operative district plans had their own specific subdivision minimum lot sizes for many of these areas, and they were largely rolled over. But there was that ability to go smaller than the minimum site size in countryside living if you were transferring an amalgamated title from a general rural production area or a mixed rural area, and development controls to require the building platform to be shown as part of a subdivision scheme plan. I think the minimum lot sizes were generally sort of 2 or 4 hectares, and then there was that potential to go smaller, down to a hectare in some cases, through the transfer or the vegetation protection controls. So the submitters, where they were coming from in terms of the rural activities, the council's enabling approach to rural activities was largely supported. Some wanted to refine the provisions rather than challenge the overall approach. Some wanted a more permissive approach to subsidiary dwellings related to the main dwelling on a rural property, more enabling provisions for workers' accommodation, post-harvest facilities, and outdoor rural tourist and visitor activities. So definitely some submissions asking for more flexibility for the list of activities in that last bullet point there. Moving on to subdivision, quite polarised views, I guess. Some strongly in support, some strongly in opposition to the council's approach. Support and opposition to this transferable rural site subdivision approach, where you can amalgamate 2 adjacent rural titles and then create a new title somewhere else and get a benefit from doing that. Somewhat more greater levels of subdivision without having to amalgamate or to protect any vegetation. They just wanted more subdivision potential. Some specified new minimum areas that they thought were appropriate, and some wanted the vegetation protection provisions to allow for subdivision on the same site, whereas in the notified plan, if you were protecting some bush and adding to it, you couldn't subdivide on that property. It just let you subdivide in another area, a countryside living area or a mixed rural area. You couldn't do it in situ. So we had some strong submissions saying, why can't I protect this vegetation and create 2, 3, 4, 5 or 10 titles on a large rural property? we had interim guidance from the panel on rural subdivision. So the panel thought that felt that the provisions were too restrictive and that there should be more provision in rural areas. Not too specific in terms of that interim guidance, just a bit of a signal that they felt that the approach that I've just discussed was too restrictive. They made mention of subdivision providing resilience to the effects of natural hazards. They talked about the productive potential of elite land should not be undermined, but I think that was obviously quite clearly a focus on elite, but not the second class, which is prime land.
Right.
So we got that quite strongly from the panel, that elite land was important, but not necessarily prime land, and that rural subdivisions should enable the protection, rehabilitation or enhancement of significant indigenous biodiversity, which, as I mentioned before, we had some controls in there that did that, but they perhaps were signalling that we should have a different regime or a more incentive for protecting indigenous biodiversity. The guidance went on in terms of talking about where rural lifestyle subdivision should be enabled and the constraints that should apply in terms of location, the scale and the density. They talked about the avoiding elite land. They talked about not impacting on mineral extraction, so quarries. You should sort of be careful in terms of allowing for subdivision around a quarry. They talked about the importance of landscapes and rural character. That needs to be factored in where subdivision might be allowed. They talked about protecting ecological areas, landscapes, avoiding reverse sensitivity effects that might hinder the rural economy, and safeguarding infrastructure. So that was the guidance from the panel after the regional policy statement. So Council's position at the hearings on the rural provisions and these 5 rural zones. In terms of rural activities, really just some refinements to the activity rules, changing some of the definitions to make them clearer, but there were some provisions endorsed by the Council and taken into the hearings to provide for a subsidiary dwelling or dwelling on a rural property with some very strict controls around that subsidiary dwelling. Also more allowance for workers' accommodation, post-harvest facilities and outdoor rural tourist and visitor activities. So we did support some more flexibility for those activities, but overall largely retained the approach. Infrastructure, again, strong submissions and evidence from the network utility companies that we had a too restrictive approach on infrastructure, so there were some changes supported there at the hearings by the Council. But Council continued to provide evidence in support of protecting elite and prime land, not just elite land, because of its productive potential and benefit to the economy. Council's position in terms of subdivision, a lot of detail here, but so it really goes through each of the 5 zones. So the rural production zone, the main zone, we had 150 hectare minimum in the notified plan. That was proposed to be reduced to 80 hectares with an average of 100. The mixed rural zone, the proposal was to reduce it from 150 to 40 hectares with an average of 50. The rural coastal zone, a new 40 hectare and a new average of 50. Previously, as I mentioned, general subdivision was simply not allowed in the rural coastal zone. Rural conservation, the new site size was proposed to be 10 hectares and an average of 20. Again, there was no provision for general subdivision in the rural conservation zone. The Council did propose limited provision for that in situ or within the site subdivision where biodiversity is being protected and enhanced on that particular site, so it didn't have to be a subdivision right that would transfer to another place. The general transfer by amalgamation was retained, but all transfers are now proposed to go into the countryside living zone. Previously, they were allowed to go into other parts of rural Auckland, and there was some evidence that that's not a good approach. It's sort of shifting the problem from one area to another. So now it's a very strong focus on the countryside living areas where if there's any amalgamation, then the new benefit should go into a countryside living area and not just shift to another part of the general rural area. And in the countryside living zone, the minimum site size is typically 2 hectares without a transfer. But if you're amalgamating and transferring into the countryside living area, then in most cases it goes down to 1 hectare. But that's not always the case. That's just the probably most common approach. All the different countryside living areas are carefully mapped with their own special subdivision controls. The prohibited activity status, i.e. you can't subdivide at all, was used much more sparingly in terms of council's evidence at the hearings to really target transfer of rural site subdivision to the appropriate receiver locations, for example, countryside living areas, and away from elite and prime soils. To avoid separating a subsidiary dwelling from the main dwelling, that would be prohibited if someone attempted to subdivide that off. And to avoid what we call double clipping of the rules, i.e. subdividing land by protecting an SEA and also using the general subdivision rules. So there was some prohibited status retained, but the very bold approach in the notified plan of widespread prohibited subdivision, we really didn't have the evidence to support that, but certainly didn't go as far as some submitters were asking for in terms of subdivision. So in this one we did very much pick up on the signals from the panel, listened very carefully to submitters, put a package of subdivision forward, and others have argued for a more permissive approach, and probably some argued for the status quo or a more restrictive approach. So as I mentioned, a very, quite a complicated topic, rural Auckland, but that's the reference to where the evidence sits on the hearing panel website, council's evidence and the evidence from a wide range of rural landowners, the farming community, horticulture community, federated farmers and so on, quarries, all have their evidence sitting in those topics.
Well done, John. Councillor Cooper.
Thank you. I want to talk about the effect or what came up in the submissions around the Waitakere Ranges Heritage Area Foothills area, because I know people submitted on that. And kind of, you've got these rules, but there's that piece of legislation, and in some of this the panel's interim guidance, did that kind of speak to any of that?
Yeah, thank you.
Because I mean, some of that is not elite land. It's not even prime land. It's old horticultural land that's basically not productive anymore, but it's not of a significant ecological value anywhere. So is that made that kind of silent because it's such a tricky area?
No, well, that really ran its own process because the Waitakere Ranges has a series of precincts on it.
Yes.
And the focus of our attention, it was not from me looking at rural areas. We just had a general zone there, but quite specifically the precinct overrode many, if not most, of the rules in that zone and really created its own code,
place to do nothing
for that. And I wasn't involved in those hearings. That was really a topic on its own with its own people.
So there's no guidance about that at the moment?
No, that really would have come up under a different topic.
So even though it's rural, it wouldn't have come up under rural? Okay.
Because of that overlay precinct. And yes, we're aware, of course, that it has its own Act of Parliament and so on. And that does have a very direct bearing on the main zones there. But in fact, the privately owned land, especially in the foothills, all has precincts on it, which are very, very specific. And I think the intention was that they carry forward the Waitakere operative plan provisions.
Okay, and so will that come up and is there any opportunity for when we actually get this stuff to tease out a little bit of that? Because there's a lot of submitters and a lot of pretty sad elderly people around that
John,
issue.
when
So will that come up when we...
It's a process question, really. So receiving the panel's recommendations in a month, 22nd of July, 27th of July, we will provide you with a briefing on the key policy shifts that we've identified from the panel and just assist you to find the relevant parts of the panel's recommendations. And then in early August, I think it's around about the 3rd or 4th of August, you'll be able to book a session with a
Great.
planner to ask them specific questions about the Waitakere Ranges or any other topic.
Thank you.
Yep.
That's helpful, thank you very much.
Councillor Walker?
Yeah, just around the elite soils, just want to get some clarification. I'm assuming that there was evidence, and we're following through on elite being not just the soil itself, but also temperature related. So what's special about Pukekohe is not just the soil, but also the frost-free aspect. So we've got that.
Absolutely. We had an approach in the plan, as many of you I'm sure will know, of really looking after not only elite land, which is technically class 1, but elite and prime land, and really our soil scientists were pivotal in helping us put that approach together, and I guess a quick rule of thumb is that there's not a lot of difference, in fact, in terms of productivity between the three land classes. It's just the inputs. You need almost no inputs into class 1. You might need to do a little bit of drainage on class 2, and it's up to the productivity of class 1. It's that kind of thing. As a parcel, we felt
I understand
it was
that.
worth
I mean,
looking after all three.
the point that was made by the vegetable growers down there is because you've got the good soils and you've got the frost-free, they can bring their potatoes forwards, and that's pretty unique.
Absolutely.
Okay,
And
that's okay.
that really underpinned, and their evidence, they gave very good submissions at the actual hearing, and support of that approach, and in fact in support of council.
Okay, and the other question I've got that just goes to subdivision and this downsizing around the minimum sizes, you know, down to 80, down to 40 and the like. I haven't read the evidence, but I'm assuming that the council's got an evidence base around that.
Yes, apparently.
Councillor, yes, to answer the question, there was an evidential base to sorting out those minimum averages and also the minimums. There was a sort of a trawl through the data on lot sizes and trying to find a position at the upper end of the scale so that, you know, from council's point of view, it was starting from a position where it really didn't want to facilitate a lot of urban development in a rural context, so it was really a case about trying to maximise size.
That's right.
Yep.
Thank you. And just clarification again, the interim guidance came back recommending avoidance of the loss of the elite soils. Are elite category 1 and then prime are 2 and 3?
Correct.
Okay, so they only talked about that first category.
Yes, they did, and that's actually a very limited area within the region.
Yeah.
In fact, just west of Pukekohe.
Okay, and our subsequent evidence was to hold the course on the first 3 categories?
All 3.
Okay, thank you. Any, Councillor Cashmore?
Yes, the 2 questions. Good to see you guys. The reverse sensitivity issues, was that across all classes?
Yes.
Of rural production? So there's
Yes. You'll see if you look at the final track change version for the regional policy that we're also looking at the productive importance of the lesser quality land. And that really comes from, largely from submissions by industries like the poultry industry and the pig industry and so on, where you don't really want them on elite and prime land, but you do want them in rural areas, and you want a place for them to go without the reverse sensitivity effects that you would get if you allowed pepper potting of subdivision. Mushrooms, I must say, is another example. So it's those kinds of industries which should be in a rural area, but not on the highest quality soils.
my second question, Mr. Chairman, is to do with SEAs, ecological blocks. And we need some clarification here. So, because Penny Webster's not here, I'm asking this really on behalf of her. They're allowing a bit of in situ, potentially, in situ subdivision or for the protection of biodiversity or additional planting to an SEA block. Is there any transferable titles provisions being requested from existing SEA areas?
Yes, the rules provide for the protection of an SEA, and in that protection, the ability to transfer in some situations. But one of the pressures that came on was around this making subdivision more enabling. And one of the issues was, well, if someone's protecting ecological area, why can't they then subdivide within that block somewhere? The response to that was to put forward evidence to say, well, that could be allowed to a certain degree. And I think a ratio of a table was developed which said, well, if you protect a certain area, then you'll get the right to create a number of lots. I think it was capped at 3. So if you went on to actually expand that SEA, then again you could get some additional lots, but the limit was 3. And again, that was a response to submissions.
And transferable titles, excuse me, was that limited to 3 as well, or was it just on a number of hectares per block or something?
With the SEA, as I understand it, there was a scale up to a maximum. It didn't go on forever, but there is a relationship between the area that you're protecting and how many lots you can get.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cashmore. Councillor Quacks.
Yeah, was any comment made about, and I can understand the desire to protect elite soils and so forth, but was there any comment made on using land for its highest economic use?
Well, that was one of the real debating issues at the hearings.
Run skyscrapers and talk.
There were those who said that this kind of intervention was unnecessary because if you look back over the last, let's say, 40 years, there's been a steady increase in production and productivity. Well, you'd expect that, of course, with the increase in the application of science and so on. But there's no doubt that the studies we had that underpinned our evidence is that there is a loss of productivity if you don't regulate in some way. And we were trying to find the appropriate balance for regulating our rural areas. So that's part of the answer to your question. Yes, the economic effects of protecting rural land, of course, had to be weighed against its other uses. But what you do find if you go for the more relaxed, highest and best use, which is, I think, the valuer's term, that what you get is a lot of fragmentation and eventually your production and your productivity dries up because of reverse sensitivity, because of value, and all those sorts of factors come into play. So the question really for us and the council was, to what extent do you want to safeguard rural production within the region? And we looked at this, and again our evidence from AT and others was that the rural sector contributes a very significant amount to the rural economy, and in fact to the urban economy, because a lot of the workers in rural areas, particularly in the abattoirs and that sort of thing, live in town and work in the country. So it's really a matter of balancing up which gives you the best economic return, quite apart from safeguarding the security of food supply for the region, given that our large horticultural areas are really right on the edge of our urban area. There's a real tension.
Yeah, the Mayor will be familiar with the report that was done for the Manukau City Council back in 2005 in regards to a piece of land which is basically now used for strawberry fields, but showed that if you used it for for commercial industrial use, the economic value from that land was 1,200% higher than it was the strawberry fields, and it created 268% more jobs than using them for strawberry fields. So I'm sure that's all been weighed up.
Well, it was, and I think we're not that short of land that we couldn't say, well, let's have both. Let's put the light industrial land on the lesser quality, and we've still got the higher productive land, so we get the strawberries and the industry. In locations like, there are specific locations like round the airport where in fact you just have to bite the bullet, and there's been a lot of debate in that particular area of this very issue because it is highly productive, as well as being near the international airport.
Thank you. Well answered, Bain. Very delighted listening to you. Thank you. Councillor Casey, finally.
Oh, it was just a comment on your use of poultry and piggeries as appropriate rural activities, given that the majority of both of these, the poor little creatures' feet never touch the ground. They could actually be anywhere in industrial areas.
I think, there's a certain amount of truth in that, I guess, but you don't normally find that. It's just the off-site effects of the dust and the smell and things like that tend not to be all that well received in an urban area.
There's a growing amount of free range, Kathy.
Oh no, I'm very happy with that. It's
Okay.
the ones that are contained in sow crates and cages that I'm talking to, where they're just stacked in a room and they never see the light of day. Really.
Barry and Bain, thank you so much for covering that section. Really well done. Thank you, John, also. Members, I think we probably need a 10-minute break. It is, can we come back at, let's say, 25 past 3?
Press the button. It's a video. I don't know.
We'll adjourn until then.
25 past.
proceed with the zoning principles, topics 8081.
Okay.
John.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if Celia and Rebecca, maybe if you could join us
Celia
in case.
and Rebecca, welcome.
All right. So, I'm just going to recap on the Auckland Plan Development Strategy because it has a very clear link to the zoning maps in the unitary plan, as I'm sure you're all very well aware. So, the Auckland Plan Development Strategy clearly talked about the quality compact urban form, but it also talked about the importance of the city centre and connecting our towns, villages and neighbourhoods. It talked about supporting the rural settlements and rural communities, increasing housing supply to meet demand and provide for diverse preferences and needs in terms of the type of housing in Auckland, optimising, integrating and aligning network utilities with planning, protecting and conserving Auckland's historic heritage, sustainably managing our natural resources and building resilience to natural hazards. So those are key parts of the Auckland Plan Development Strategy that cascade into the regional policy statement and the unitary plan and then into the zoning maps. So the regional policy statement picked up on the language of a quality compact urban form with growth primarily focused within the metropolitan area 2010 by enabling higher densities within and around centres and within moderate walking distance of centres and the rapid and frequent transport network, provided they're adequately serviced by existing infrastructure or where infrastructure can be installed or efficiently upgraded and reverse sensitivity effects can be managed. But this overarching direction in terms of growth in the regional policy statement, which came from the Auckland Plan, was balanced with other parts of the regional policy statement around protecting historic heritage, historic character, natural heritage, managing risks from natural hazards, protecting major infrastructure from reverse sensitivity, and also heavy industrial areas. So that's the kind of overarching growth strategy in the RPS. Then looking at the unitary plan zones, they're grouped into four broad categories. There are the 6 residential zones that we talked about at the last meeting. There are the 10 business zones, the 5 rural zones that we've talked about, and then we have some other zones, public open space, coastal zones, some special purpose zones, future urban, strategic transport corridor, which is essentially the state highway network and the rail network, and we proposed at the hearings a new landfill zone for the Red Vale landfill. So the reason for adopting zoning principles, and this was by the Auckland Development Committee in April last year, was twofold really. The first was to embark on the mammoth task of responding to, and it says approximately 20,000 zoning submission points. We might need to just double check that number. Rebecca, do you know roughly? Or Celia, it was approximately 20,000 submission points, and also to ensure that the spatial application or the mapping of the zones was consistent with the objectives and policies of the plan as a whole. So that's why we brought some draft principles to committee last April. One of the first key principles is based on the idea of a moderate walking distance, which is language used in the regional policy statement, and the idea of a decreasing level of density or intensification as you move away from the metropolitan town and local centres and rail stations or other major public transport hubs. With the first zone that you would encounter would be, residential zone would be the terrace and apartment building zone, then moving out to the mixed housing urban at 3 stories, and then mixed housing suburban, and then lastly the single house zone. This is very conceptual. In many parts of the zoning maps you will see the single house zone hard up against a town centre or a major public transport route for reasons such as the historic character that might be present in those areas. So moving into the principles that the committee endorsed for the residential zones, and they're very much a guide. This isn't hard and fast stuff. When you're looking at over 1 million parcels of land in Auckland, there's a huge complexity to how you actually develop the zoning maps. But as a general guide, this zone should apply within 250 metres, thereabouts, of the large metropolitan town and local centres, within approximately 250 metres of the rapid and frequent transport network and arterial roads, and within close proximity to existing or proposed large open spaces, community facilities, education facilities or healthcare facilities. And that was the general guide in looking at submissions on this particular zone. The 3-storey mixed housing urban zone should generally apply 250 metres walking distance from the terrace and apartment zone. So the first, that sort of goes back to this diagram here, with the blue being the first 250 metres and the next 250 being the mixed housing urban. This zone should also be applied adjacent to smaller neighbourhood centres and adjacent to some public open spaces or community facilities. Some images of the sort of 2 to 3 storey terraced housing and low-rise apartment buildings in that zone. Mixed housing suburban zone should generally apply to any parts of Auckland that don't fall within that first 250 metres or the second 250 metres. So once you're getting beyond 500 metres of a centre or a public transport hub, then mixed housing suburban would be the best zone to use. Unless there are significant infrastructure or accessibility or flooding constraints, in which case the single house zone would be more appropriate, unless it's within the height sensitive area overlay. Sorry, it should apply in a height sensitive area overlay, or it should apply to sites which aren't in the historic character overlay. So there are some situations where the zone wouldn't be appropriate even though it's beyond that 500 metres. So the single house zone should generally apply to areas with significant environmental constraints, infrastructure constraints that can't be addressed or unlikely to be in the foreseeable future, areas with poor accessibility to centres or the existing or planned public transport network, large urban facilities, etc. This is the zone that would be applied to places like Omaha, Matakana, where there is wastewater, reticulated wastewater in the rural parts of Auckland. It's the zone that should be applied to the special or historic character overlay within the height sensitive areas around the volcanic maunga, and within on sites that have a significant ecological area where that area is covering more than 20% of the site. It's a site with quite a large area of vegetation, indigenous vegetation, and with significant flooding risk. The large lot zone should generally apply to sites with geotechnical issues, high ecological or landscape values on the periphery of urban Auckland, but inside the rural-urban boundary, and typically they wouldn't have reticulated wastewater, so they would be on septic tanks. And lastly, the rural and coastal settlement zone, rural parts of Auckland that are settlements, but they don't have wastewater servicing, for example, Kopakapa and Waitoki. It's the residential zones. In terms of the business zones, the first group of business zones, as per the earlier presentation, we've got the 5 categories of centres. They should be selected generally according to the Auckland plan, so a lot of work was done through the Auckland plan to define those 5 categories of centres and list them. And there's some guidance, because we had a lot of submissions asking for an expansion of centres, and so there's some guidance in the regional policy statement to guide where that might be appropriate. The other business zone, the mixed-use zone, should be applied adjacent to the city centre, metropolitan centres, town centres, and along arterials that have good public transport networks, and within locations that won't harm the what we call the vitality and viability of the centres nearby to them. Then we have the general business zones. They should apply. That zone should apply close to the city centre, metropolitan centre, and town centres along identified growth corridors and arterials. So this is the essentially the large format retail zone, and in locations that won't harm the vitality and viability of the centres. And then we have the business park zone, where there's a significant level of existing office development, for example, Smales Farm on the North Shore, already established, and again, establishing new business park zones does run the risk of adversely impacting on centres, so it shouldn't apply where that's going to take place. We've got the two industrial zones and some principles there around where they would be applied. Heavy industrial around existing well-established heavy industrial areas should try and avoid getting too close to residential, and light industry where there are established light industrial activities and often around heavy industrial areas to have a buffer to create a buffer from residential or mixed-use development. Here are the principles endorsed for the rural production zone. Generally apply to large rural properties, low intensity settlement, the rural coastal, adjacent to and immediately beyond the coastal environment with landscape and amenity links to the coast. The countryside living zone should apply in locations that avoid sensitive areas such as natural landscapes, elite and prime land and quarries, and don't compromise rural production, and in locations where there are existing small sites around rural townships. The mixed rural zone, that's the zone that should be applied where there's a history of established horticulture, viticulture, greenhouse production of flowers, fruit, vegetables, wine production, intensive poultry farming and equine related activities and services. Just turning to some of the more specialised zones, the school, tertiary education and retirement villages. So the special purpose school zone should apply to independent or integrated schools, and that's what the submitters on those submitters were seeking. But in terms of state schools, tertiary education and retirement villages, a move away from the notified plan, which had special zones for each of those, and moving towards whatever is the most logical, sensible rural residential or business zone, rather than having a special zone for tertiary, state schools or retirement villages. And that, in terms of the state schools, that approach was supported by the Ministry of Education. Moving from the zones to overlays and how some of these overlays might impact on the zoning, we had some principles endorsed by the committee around the historic character overlay, and the first one is that really it should, in the vast majority of cases, be the single house zone that applies under this overlay. The second two bullet points there are just indicating that there might be some situations where mixed housing suburban would be appropriate, but there would have to be an extensive survey to identify those areas. In terms of pre-1944, we had a bit of a change of approach with this principle. So in the notified plan, there was no relationship between the 44 overlay and zoning. You'll see all sorts of zones sitting under the 1944 overlay. There was no link at all. The Council's approach for the hearings was to adopt a principle of applying the single house zone, mixed housing suburban, a centre or a mixed use zone, if that's what was in the notified plan. But if in the notified plan it was mixed housing urban or terrace and apartment buildings, then the zoning should be essentially down-zoned to mixed housing suburban. And just a couple of notes there. The areas where the Council had proposed to reduce the 1944 overlay, essentially remove it, there are no heritage reasons or constraints, so therefore there should be no zoning principle in the areas that are no longer within the Council's proposed overlay. And individual sites within the overlay are potential heritage sites, but they should not influence the zoning. So we have many heritage buildings in Auckland on the schedule, and the zoning is independent of that overlay where it's an individual site. SEAs, where a site has more than 20% SEA cover, it should either be the single house or the large lot zone. In urban areas, obviously in rural areas, it should be the most logical rural zone. Other residential zones would be appropriate if the overlay covers less than 20% of the site. The height-sensitive areas around the volcanic cones, we have a principle of using the single house or the mixed housing suburban because they have a 2-storey height limit, which is consistent with the height control in the height-sensitive area overlay. Floodplains, there should be no business or residential zoning in terms of new areas, business and residential zones should be avoided where there is significant flooding risk. Within existing urban areas, there was a very detailed set of principles developed by the stormwater team around zoning within flooding areas, and those principles were endorsed by the committee last April. I think this is the last slide in terms of overlays. So within the flight paths to the airports, appropriate zones would be heavy industry, or a zone that reflects the current operative district plan, or a less intensive zone. So essentially no residential intensification within the aircraft noise overlays. In terms of the electricity transmission corridor, the key principle there is really that the terrace and apartment zone, the 5 to 7 story zone, should not be located within that corridor directly under the transmission lines. Interestingly on that one, the Transpower who managed the high voltage lines were quite happy for any zoning under the overlay. They felt the overlay would be sufficient to manage development under the overlay. They can also rely on a national environmental standard to protect those transmission corridors. The panel issued some best practice approaches for rezoning. They didn't get right down into the principles around individual zones in the way that the council did in this guidance. They were really just, some of them are more technical nature, some are more strategic. So the first one, that any zoning on the map should be consistent with the objectives and policies of the zone. The overall impact of any rezoning through the submissions and hearings process should ensure that the maps are consistent with the regional policy statement. Economic costs and benefits should be considered. Any changes to the maps that went out for submissions should take into account issues debated in recent plan changes. Changes to the zone boundaries should be consistent with the Auckland-wide rules and overlays. We weren't probably entirely clear what the panel's best practice approach was there. Changes should take into account the specific features of the site and the land that it's on. Zone boundary changes should recognise the availability or lack of major infrastructure. There should be adequate separation between incompatible land uses, i.e. houses should not be next to heavy industry. So there's some consistency with the council's principles. Any zone boundaries need to be clearly defensible. They should follow property boundaries and not slice through the middle of a property. Spot zoning, i.e. a single site or a couple of sites just on their own within a wider zone, should be avoided. Zoning shouldn't be determined by an existing resource consent or an existing use right, but these can be taken into account, and roads should not be zoned. They should simply be shown as roads. And yeah, that's really a summary of the principles endorsed by the committee that influenced a lot of the mapping work that took place and the guidance from the panel.
Again, well done, John. Queries on this particular section, members? Simon. Come on up, Simon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Noting that topics 80 and 81 are the most controversial, I'll try not to be, but I'll ask and we'll see how that goes.
Who said that, Simon? No one here today has said that.
Easy.
Maybe I'm casting aspersions on the process. Anyway,
talking about the zoning principles.
Yeah, so I mean the principles and our board were largely supportive of them. They effectively gave effect to the RPS and also were reflected in the zone objectives and policies. And so it sort of it showed a sensible approach to how you'd look at kind of zoning and that sort of thing, and that was applied. That came up with a series of maps after the PORP was notified, and about how they might be applied, and took into account kind of constraints being removed in terms of the 1944 controls and those sorts of things. I'm just interested in, obviously there's two ways to go for the panel. There is looking back at the RPS and the zone objectives and policies, if there's a conflict between those and the zoning maps. or to look at the zoning and create the alignment there. Do we have any indication sort of which way we're leaning? Because obviously with these principles, there's potentially a gap there. And I guess the second thing is given that most of the submissions were sitting sort of on the latter approach, do we have any indication whether the panel was sort of there, noting that we didn't have experts to provide a counter view, more in a moderate camp on that one?
It's a bit difficult. I mean, you're almost asking for a telegraphing of the report or the recommendations that are yet to be tabled. So I think we need to be careful about even asking our staff, you know, which way the IHP is leaning.
I understand that, Chris, but in terms of all of the other topics that have been presented, at least there was a view of where submitters were pushing and discussion so far. So I guess I'm asking along those lines rather than to make windows into the minds of the interviewing.
So do we have any interim guidance?
Well, no, they called this one best practice approaches, not interim guidance. And as I say, it was sort of strategic stuff about linking into the RPS and objectives and policies in the plan, and in more technical mapping stuff. They didn't really talk about individual zones. In terms of submitters, I mean, I can make the comment, I think as you've heard before, Housing New Zealand were probably one of the most vocal submitters.
Sorry, guys.
Goodness sake. Get a hold of yourself, girl.
We're not listening.
The ambassador for the SPCA was just checking.
They get outside.
Can someone take that man on a tech course? Okay, we'll carry on.
So, yes, we know Housing New Zealand developed their own principles and presented evidence at the panel, and their principles were different to the principles that we ran through here. They were broadly seeking a more expansive terrace and apartment zoning and a more expansive mixed housing urban zoning in most places. Other submitters, I don't know if anyone came in fully behind the council and said we support the council's principles. Can you recall, Celia, Rebecca?
I think mostly it was people who were most interested in their own particular sites.
Yeah.
So Housing New Zealand was probably, and the Architects Association, they were more interested in the strategic influence and how that influenced the zoning at ground level. So there was, most of the other submitters though was about their own particular properties.
I guess, I mean, in terms of the panel's best practice approaches, I mean, the second bullet point is obviously the keenest one, and Housing New Zealand seemed to focus on this one as well as the Minister in their submission, which is the overall impact of rezoning is consistent with the RPS. And I guess that's going to be the crunchy thing that will definitely come up, and there was a lot of debate there. I guess it's just trying to understand, was that just a stark statement without any further explanation in terms of whether or not the council's approach in the notified plan met this or didn't? Or
well, as I think we've mentioned, there has been no guidance as to whether the panel felt the council's maps were heading in the right direction or not, but what we do know is that they were very interested in the capacity for growth modelling work, both the feasible and the enabled capacity work that's been presented to the committee before. I'm not sure if you've heard any of those presentations, but our experts and the experts from other submitters, Housing New Zealand, property developers, Auckland 2040, were all involved in that modelling work, and we certainly got a sense that the panel thought that modelling work was absolutely critical in terms of looking at how the zoning maps and the zone rules, particularly for residential, relate back to the RPS. So you get a strong sense that the panel was looking at the whole capacity issue from a rules perspective, from a maps perspective, linking it all back to the RPS and their thoughts around the RPS. So, yeah, I'd certainly make that as a comment. And in terms of who was aligned with our principles, we did have Institute of Architects, Urban Auckland, Gen Zero, basically say they thought that these principles were pretty robust and pretty sound.
And I guess, and take your guidance, Mr. Chair, that we'll have to wait and see, but I guess the crunchy bit will be, we've got principles, and whether or not the zones actually map onto those will be the key thing. And then if the panel feels that they don't, then it's going to be interesting, the recommendation of either changing the principles or changing the zones. But I guess I'll have to wait on that one. Thank you.
We will all have to wait. Councillor Cashmore.
Yes, thanks. Slightly different note. Within the rural zone, you've got the countryside living zone, and then we talk about quarries and not to compromise their activity. Because in fact, those three big quarries that are in the south that provide 80%, 3 million tonnes of aggregate for Auckland a year, either are on or close proximity or travel immediately through countryside living zones. Yep. And I live with the reverse sensitivity that causes on a virtually day-by-day basis. What work is being done around that route protection? Is that anywhere in the unitary plan as proposed?
Yeah, well, I suppose this principle is signalling that if through the submissions process council was looking to apply new countryside living areas, we shouldn't be applying any more adjacent to those quarries because there are already existing reverse sensitivity issues there. So this principle is quite good in helping us respond to submissions that asked for more countryside living around a quarry. And there weren't a huge number, but there were some. But in addition to the zones, we have a quarry transport route that provides some protection for existing quarries, and also the quarry buffer area that gives some additional protection for the quarries.
Lay it out.
Yeah, so there are two overlays that gives that protection for the quarries. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cashmore. Councillor Walker.
Yeah, just a related issue to quarries, and these are clean fills, which are not quarries, but they amount to holes in the ground. They get filled up in some respects with worse product than you have in quarries, clay and stuff that generates a lot of dust. You've got a significant number of transport movements, significant, and I mean significant reverse sensitivity effects for neighbouring landowners. Are we tightening up around them in any way, shape or form?
I can't recall their exact activity status, but it would either be probably discretionary or non-complying in most of the rural areas. So any future clean fills would go through a resource consent process, and then it really becomes an issue of whether or not those clean fills are consented, and if they are consented, what conditions are placed on the consent to deal with volumes of traffic, upgrading transport networks and so on. So the unitary plan certainly has restrictions in place on any new clean fills in Auckland, and good policies in place to look at the impacts of those.
Okay, well, I guess I just put the principle to you that we've got these things around quarries. Sometimes the impacts from clean fills are even worse, and you know, issues of reverse sensitivity and the like aren't considered to anywhere near the same degree from my experience.
Thank you. Any last questions on this particular section, members? Zoning principles? Then I think we're concluded. John, anything else to add?
Yeah, this was the 5th of our information sessions. We've got one more before the 22nd of July when the panel comes back with its recommendations. So I think in a fortnight, we're doing a bit of a recap on the overall process, some of the legal parameters around decision making that were talked about by Catherine and her team in the first information session. So really the next one is just a bit of a recap on the first session. I don't think we're talking about any unitary plan topics, or we are? We've got.
Yeah,
oh, we've still got.
We're talking about infrastructure, transport, and flooding and hazards.
Oh, just a few minor ones, but. And in addition to that, we're doing a recap on the process, and then we're into the last week or two before the panel's recs come back.
Okay, and it's probably worth just reminding us again the date of receipt within council management of the recommendations, and then the interim, very short interim period, the date the councillors receive the information.
So it's Friday the 22nd of July. We expect to receive one on a USB stick, the panel's recommendations and revisions to the unitary plan. We're not sure exactly what time on that Friday the 22nd. We'll have a small team of our lead people really analysing those over the weekend, preparing for a briefing for the committee and local board chairs on the following Wednesday morning, which is the 27th of July. And then Wednesday afternoon or evening, all of the recommendations and everything from the panel will be on the council website for the public on that following Wednesday.
So just in terms of the Wednesday, would it be prior to the Wednesday or on the Wednesday that the councillors receive the information?
It will be on the Wednesday.
On the Wednesday. Councillor Fletcher?
Mr. Chairman, I'm just seeking some guidance. I've been very mindful of the request that we don't make public comment, and that isn't easy because, you know, that is sought. But I'd just like clarification in and around this, just so that we all know exactly where we stand on this issue.
Okay, John and maybe Catherine? Thanks for that question. So it's an important one to go over again.
So I'm not sure whether there's a particular question arising out of the advice that's been circulated in terms of the lack of clarity as to the limits on discussion.
I guess I'm aware that some councillors have actually, I've wanted to have a view on things, but I've refrained from commenting. But where there is a council position, council laws at liberty to, I don't want to point the finger at any one person, but I just want to make sure there's no inconsistencies.
Well, there's certainly consistency in the advice that's been provided around exercising caution. Of course, it's, you know, it will be the case that people can talk quite openly about the process and explaining the sequencing and what's happening. There's no issue with that. But in terms of the caution is to, you know, for each of the members here for their protection, so that they're seen to be keeping themselves open to the decision-making role, important decision-making role that they'll be carrying out in August.
Councillor Fletcher, do you have a...
No, I don't want to take it any further.
Mr. Chairman.
Councillor Quicks.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think that, and I don't want to be insensitive here, but I think Councillor Fletcher is referring to an op-ed piece that appeared in the Herald yesterday from the Deputy Mayor, raising issues that are clearly within the scope of the unitary plan and the decisions that we will be making over the next couple of months. And I thought that the direction from both our staff and before that on other matters from outside legal counsel was quite clear about this. So perhaps, Catherine, you might like to reiterate what you told us some time ago, and or perhaps give us some guidance on how far we can actually go, because it seemed to me that what the Deputy Mayor had in the op-ed piece, certainly I wouldn't have written anything like that, and I doubt if other councillors who are mindful of the advice that's been given to us would have made similar comments.
Okay, look, I don't really want to interrogate the opinion piece of the Deputy Mayor.
No,
but
that's
I
not
think
that's not
at
the
a
issue.
higher level,
Yeah,
Catherine,
exactly.
can you just respond at a higher level without referencing a particular councillor at this meeting or a particular piece of writing?
I'll just emphasise, I mean, the advice that's come to you has attempted to provide you with quite practical details around, you know, what you can say, what you might say in response to somebody attempting to seek your view or attempting to speak to you about their perspective on what you might do when you are here in your decision-making role. So I'll just reiterate the content of that advice, yes, but I don't think it'll be helpful for me to be drawn into in this forum a discussion of particular particular circumstances.
I've got a question there,
Councillor Wood?
Yeah, well,
Oh, sorry, I've got Councillor Casey, then Councillor Wood. Sorry, Councillor Wood.
I wasn't aware it was the Herald opinion piece that you were referring to, Chris. Mine was about responding to, there will be inevitable lobbying between now and August. Witness Eden Park, and that's all I'm going to say. But I'm very clear about our rules are that we just let it go. Just let it go.
That's right, and it's particularly important, and the advice that you've been given is around responding to people who want to lobby you, and that's exactly the reason why the legislation has this, provision in it. It's to protect you as from that lobbying. What's happened here is that we've, consistent with the wishes of this group, we're making the recommendations from the panel publicly available much earlier than we're required to do under the legislation. The legislation contemplates that at the time council releases its decision, it also releases the recommendation. Because we're doing things in a more transparent way and putting it out there in the public domain on the 27th of July, that's the need for the extra caution around protecting yourself from lobbying, because ordinarily you would not be, in one view, you would not be in that position because others would not know what the recommendations were.
But what's happened is there is a huge hole, a big gap, because all the politicians who would normally be speaking out about an issue aren't, and that leaves a gap for wannabe mayors and wannabe candidates and anybody else, any lobbyists from across the region to fill the gap. So it's an interesting position to be in, because every morning I open the paper and I'm just like, oh.
That's just the case. I've got Councillor Wood, then Councillor Lee, then Councillor
I just think that this issue of councillors being gagged needs to be discussed further.
Sounds good to me.
I think with the election coming up especially. So, I was surprised yesterday. I mean, we've now been told we're not to talk about debt, but because there's a bond issue or some issue coming up. But we're told about it today. We're in an election cycle. I don't know where we're heading, but those issues really pose a huge number of issues. If you're going around door knocking and you've got a brochure, you put them away for the...
You just have to strike out debt, George.
Well, yeah, but it is, these are issues, Catherine, that need to be, I think they should have been talked with councillors about. I mean, we seem to be just operating in a vacuum here. We get emails saying, you're not to do this, you're not to do that. It's a pity we don't get told or get some heads up on these things.
Well, I think,
Which is the way the
Councillor Wood,
military
I think we did have heads up. We had heads up on the the distribution that came from Catherine's office was just reinforcing what was actually conveyed at an earlier meeting.
Well,
and members had asked repeatedly for some guidance on that, and the Chief Legal Counsel offered that advice. I do not interpret this as gagging, it's advice, but if you maybe don't follow the advice, there could be consequences.
The Deputy Mayor's out there making statements and writing...
Look, there is no suggestion, councillors, that there is a gagging order in place, none whatsoever. But you've received the advice, I take it as pretty clear. And you can, you can follow the advice or not, but there could be consequences.
I think though, but I'm just talking in general now, I think that discussion between the executive team and the councillors is important, and we're not having that interface with the executive team at the moment. And I just feel that I've been in councils for a number of times, number of years, and I think at the moment this place is run in two separate things. We're just like the chooks that have fed the agenda.
Councillor Lee.
So I just want to make that point. I've made it. Thank you.
Thank you. Look, I often find myself disagreeing with Councillor Quacks and his philosophy and his convictions, but I want to make the point. Councillor Quacks has got the courage of his convictions, a quality that Auckland needs a bit more of. Thank you very much, Councillor Quacks.
Councillor Quacks, would you like to reply to that accolade?
Oh,
If I get another chance, this will be
words fail me, Mr. Chairman.
singlets,
Look, Mr. Chairman, I just want to do,
You mean he hasn't sold them yet?
I just wanted to ask Catherine, because Catherine, your advice to us seems to be a lot more general and somewhat, I don't know if you're moving away from your earlier advice, I don't think you are, but I recall quite clearly that you even said that we should refrain from even such things as saying, liking something
That's right.
on Facebook.
That's right.
And certainly, writing an op-ed piece in the New Zealand Herald is much more blatant than liking something on Facebook.
I think we need to be careful because I don't, look, I browsed that particular opinion piece and I don't know what part of that opinion piece you're referring to, and we don't have it before us, and this is not the subject of the meeting. Councillor
No,
Quach,
I understand
really
that, but
think-
it's very
have you
important,
take-
Mr Chair, to understand.
Have you taken it up with the writer?
No, I haven't. She's not here, is she?
Well, no.
She hasn't been here for 2 days.
The Deputy Mayor has been about, but you could approach. I'm going to conclude the meeting. Thank you very much, all the staff, John, Catherine, and all the staff that have been supporting the various items today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Meeting's closed.